The morning light caught the dust motes dancing above my coffee cup, the same ceramic mug Helen had bought me 32 years ago from that little shop in Branson. World's Best Dad. It still read, though the letters had faded to a whisper. I sat at the kitchen table of our lake house, watching the water beyond the window hold the October sky like a mirror that knew how to keep secrets. This place had been Helen's dream first. She'd walked through these empty rooms when they still smelled of fresh lumber and sawdust, her hand trailing along walls that existed more in possibility than reality. "This is where we'll grow old together," she'd said, as if she could see our future written in the grain of the wood. She'd been right about the growing old part. She just hadn't planned on me finishing the job alone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times each note, echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. Every piece of furniture carried her fingerprints. The dining table where she'd hosted 23 Christmas dinners, the built-in bookshelves where she'd arranged her romance novels and garden magazines in perfect order, the window seat where she'd sit with her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with the rain against the glass. 3 years since the funeral, and I still caught myself setting 2 coffee cups on the counter some mornings. The sound of gravel under tires broke through my reverie. I recognized the engine Ethan's new SUV, the one I'd helped him finance when his old truck finally gave up. Through the window, I watched my son step out, followed by Madison, his wife of 4 years. Then came 2 other figures I'd only met a handful of times, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. Ethan looked prosperous in his charcoal suit, the kind that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in a year. His hair was shorter than I remembered, touched with silver, that made him look distinguished rather than aging. Madison wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly pension, her blonde hair arranged in one of those styles that takes an hour to look effortless. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days, better to meet whatever's coming on your own terms. "Dad." Ethan's smile was bright and practiced. "You look good." "Son." I stepped back to let them pass. "Madison, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." The hallway suddenly felt crowded, filled with expensive perfume, and the particular tension that comes when people want something they haven't asked for yet. Gerald's eyes swept the living room, taking inventory of the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the hardwood floors Helen and I had refinished together one humid summer. "Coffee," I offered, because Helen had trained me to be a host even when I didn't feel like hosting. "This won't take long," Ethan said, which should have been my first warning. We settled in the living room, them on the sofa Helen had reupholstered in soft green fabric, me in my reading chair with its view of the lake. The morning light slanted through the windows, illuminating the careful way they had arranged themselves, like a delegation. "Dad," Ethan began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "We need to talk about your situation here." I waited. In construction, you learn that silence often carries more weight than words. People will fill the quiet with more truth than they intended to share. "Madison's parents are facing some challenges," he continued. "Their lease is up next month, and with Gerald's recent retirement," he gestured toward Gerald, who nodded gravely as if confirming a tragedy. "We've been looking at senior communities," Gerald added, "but the waiting lists are extensive, and the costs—" He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Their family," Madison said, her voice soft but insistent. "And this house has so much space, more than you really need." The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel them watching my face, studying my reaction. But I'd spent 40 years managing construction crews and negotiating contracts. My expression didn't change. "I see," I said finally. "We thought," Ethan said, speaking faster now, "that it might actually be good for everyone. You'd have company and they'd have a place to call home. It makes sense, doesn't it?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who'd learned to fish from this dock, who'd helped me build the tire swing that still hung from the old oak tree, who'd brought Helen wildflowers every Mother's Day until he left for college. That boy had been replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who spoke about my life as if it were a problem to be solved. "And where would I go?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch them off guard. Madison's smile faltered. Gerald shifted in his seat. Patricia's hands tightened on her purse. "There's a nice community in Clearwater," Patricia offered brightly. "Garden apartments, meal service activities. You'd have people your own age to socialize with. People my own age, as if loneliness could be cured by proximity to other lonely people. What if I don't want to move? I asked. Ethan's jaw tightened, a habit I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught in a lie. Dad, be reasonable. You're 70 years old. This house is too big, too isolated. What if something happens? What if you fall or have another episode? That's what he called my heart attack 3 years ago, as if it were a television show that had run too long. I manage fine, I said. For now, Madison interjected. But wouldn't it be better to plan ahead, to make the transition while you're still healthy enough to adapt? I stood and walked to the window, facing the lake. The morning mist was burning off, revealing water that reflected the October sky like polished steel. Helen's garden was still blooming. The late roses she'd coaxed through 15 summers, the Japanese maple she'd planted to turn brilliant red this time of year. This house isn't just a house, I said without turning around. It's where Helen and I built our life together. Every room holds 32 years of marriage. She's gone, Dad. Ethan's voice was gentler now, but the words still cut. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. I turned to face them, 4 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for me to crumble, to accept their logic, to make their lives easier by diminishing my own. The answer is no, I said quietly. Gerald leaned forward. Richard, let's be practical about this. The upkeep alone must be. The answer is no, I repeated. Ethan stood, running a hand through his silver hair. Dad, we're trying to help you. Can't you see that? Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for. Everything Helen and I built together. Move on, Madison said sharply. That's what normal people do. They move on. The room went silent. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable with the naked honesty of it, but Madison had said what they were all thinking, that my grief was inconvenient, my attachment to this place unreasonable. I appreciate your concern, I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. But this is my home. It will remain my home. Ethan's face flushed. And what about family? What about helping people when they need it? You mean the family that visits twice a year? The family that calls on holidays if they remember? That's not fair. Isn't it? I looked at each of them in turn. When did you last ask how I was doing? Not what I could do for you, but how I was managing. No one answered. I thought so, I said. They filed out without another word, their expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floors Helen and I had chosen together. I watched from the window as they climbed back into the SUV, their body language stiff with indignation and disappointment. As the sound of their engine faded, I returned to my reading chair and picked up the coffee mug that had gone cold during their visit. The ceramic felt familiar in my hands, worn smooth by years of morning rituals. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the water, its voice lonely and wild. I thought about Helen, about the way she would have handled this conversation. She'd never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes mattered. She'd fought the insurance company when they had tried to deny coverage for my surgery. She'd fought the county when they had wanted to rezone our road. She'd fought her cancer with grace and determination until the very end. Fight, I could almost hear her whisper. Don't let them take what's ours. I set down the empty mug and walked to Helen's desk, where she'd kept our important papers in neat labeled files. I pulled out the deed to the house and spread it on the desk, reading every word as if seeing it for the first time. The house was mine, bought and paid for. No mortgage, no liens, no legal obligation to anyone but myself. Ethan could ask, could plead, could guilt me all he wanted, but he couldn't take what belonged to me, not unless I let him, and I had no intention of letting him. The October wind stirred the surface of the lake, sending ripples across water that had been still as glass when the morning began. Change was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the set of my shoulders, in the steel that had entered my spine, somewhere between "please think about it" and "goodbye." My son had made his choice. Now I would make mine. Comment your age to see how diverse the audience is here. The silence after they left felt different from my usual solitude. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man who'd chosen to be alone with his memories. It was the hollow echo of something breaking. I sat in my chair for a long time after the SUV disappeared, watching the lake change color as clouds drifted across the sun. Finally, I stood and began the ritual of straightening up, though there wasn't much to straighten. 4 coffee cups that had gone unused, cushions that needed refluffing where unwelcome visitors had sat. I carried the cups to the kitchen and washed them by hand the way Helen had taught me. The dishwasher's for big messes, she'd say. These little things deserve personal attention. Personal attention. When had I stopped giving Ethan that? The question followed me as I moved through the house, checking windows, adjusting the thermostat, performing the small acts of maintenance that filled my days. In the hallway, I paused before the gallery wall. Helen had created 3 decades of family photographs, arranged with her artist's eye for balance and story. There was Ethan at 2 chocolate cakes smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, missing his front teeth, but grinning as he held up the base he'd caught off our dock. At 16, lanky and serious in his baseball uniform. At 25, nervous and proud in his wedding tuxedo. Madison radiant beside him in her grandmother's dress. I studied that last photo looking for clues I'd missed at the time. Had there been warning signs? Had Madison's smile been too practiced, too aware of the camera? Or was I reading the present into the past, looking for explanations that weren't there? The truth was simpler and more painful. People changed. The boy who'd spent summer afternoons helping me rebuild the dock, who'd listened with genuine interest as I explained the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, had grown into a man I barely recognized. When had it started? I traced the timeline backwards, looking for the moment when concern became condescension, when love became obligation. Maybe it was college, when Ethan discovered there was a world beyond this lake, one where fathers were measured not by the calluses on their hands, but by the numbers in their bank accounts. Maybe it was his first job in the city where success meant corner offices and client dinners. Or maybe it was Helen's diagnosis. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 4 years ago, autumn like this one, when the doctors had used words like aggressive and metastatic, with the casual precision of carpenters discussing wood grain. Helen had taken the news with characteristic grace, already planning how to spend whatever time remained. But Ethan had looked at me as if I'd somehow failed him, as if a better father would have prevented this. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at Helen's garden. She'd spent her last good months there, planting bulbs she'd never see, bloom-tending roses she'd never smell again. "Promise me you'll keep it going," she'd whispered during one of those endless hospital nights. "Promise me something beautiful will still grow here." I'd promised. And I'd kept that promise, teaching myself the difference between annuals and perennials, learning which plants needed deadheading and which should be left alone. The garden still bloomed every spring, a riot of color and fragrance that Helen had orchestrated from her hospital bed. After the funeral, something had shifted between us. The shared grief I'd expected never materialized. Instead, Ethan had thrown himself into work, into his marriage, into anything that didn't require him to sit with sadness. And I'd retreated into this house, into routines that kept Helen's presence alive, into a solitude that felt safer than risking more loss. We'd become strangers who shared a name and a history, but no common language for what came next. The afternoon light was fading when I finally made my way to the garage. This had been my sanctuary during the building years, the place where I'd restored the '67 Mustang that became Ethan's first car. The workbench still held my tools, arranged with the precision of a man who knew that disorder led to accidents. I pulled down a photo album. Helen had made one I hadn't opened in months. The pages were filled with construction photos, the house rising from bare foundation to finished home, season by season, year by year. Helen had documented everything, me mixing concrete in the August heat, Ethan at 10 helping to carry lumber, the 3 of us standing before the completed fireplace. In one photo, Ethan couldn't have been more than 12. He wore my old work gloves comically large on his small hands and held a hammer with the reverent care of a boy who believed his father could build anything. His smile was pure joy, untainted by the calculations that now seemed to drive every interaction. "What happened to you?" I whispered to the photograph. The answer came to me gradually, like dawn breaking over the lake. Money, not just the lack of it, but the hunger for it, the way it had gradually replaced every other value in his life. His expensive clothes, the new SUV, the casual mention of senior communities, as if my entire existence could be reduced to a line item in someone else's budget. I closed the album and returned it to its shelf. Outside, the first stars were appearing in a sky that had gone from blue to purple to black while I'd been lost in memory. The automatic timer had turned on the porch light just as Helen had programmed it years ago. "A home should never greet you in darkness," she used to say. Back in the kitchen, I made myself a simple dinner: grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like childhood. Helen would have added herbs to the soup, maybe a side salad to balance the richness of the cheese. But Helen wasn't here, and I was learning to be okay with simple things done simply. As I ate, I found myself thinking about the deed I'd read earlier. The legal language was precise, unambiguous. This house belonged to me, purchased with money I'd earned, laying foundation after foundation, frame after frame, until my small construction company had grown into something substantial enough to buy this place outright. Ethan had never asked about those early years, about the 16-hour days and the jobs I'd taken in driving rain, because we needed the money. He'd never wanted to hear about the risks I'd taken, the loans I'd secured with everything we owned as collateral. To him, this house had simply always existed, a given, rather than something fought for and won. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times as I finished washing my plate. Through the kitchen window, I could see the lights of distant houses across the lake, other families settling in for the evening, probably watching television or helping children with homework, normal lives proceeding normally. I thought about calling my lawyer, Marcus Reed, a man I'd known for 20 years. He'd handled the purchase of this house, helped me navigate the complexities of business contracts, and guided me through the legal maze after Helen's death. If anyone could help me understand my options, it would be Marcus. But not tonight. Tonight was for thinking, for letting the reality of what had happened settle in my bones like cold after a long day in winter weather. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in Helen's favorite chair, the one positioned to catch both the morning light and the view of the lake. Her knitting basket still sat beside it, filled with projects she'd never finished. Sometimes I thought about donating them to the church, but I wasn't ready to let go of the evidence that she'd been planning a future, even when she knew her time was limited. The house settled around me with its familiar nighttime sounds, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the grandfather clock, marking time with mechanical precision. These sounds had been the soundtrack of our marriage, the audio backdrop to 32 years of shared mornings and quiet evenings. Ethan wanted to take this from me. Not just the building, but the memories embedded in every board and nail. He wanted to hand it over to strangers who would rearrange the furniture and paint over the careful color choices Helen had made. They would never know that the small scuff mark on the dining room wall came from the Christmas when Ethan was 8 and had gotten overexcited opening presents. They would never understand that the slightly uneven kitchen tile was because I'd insisted on doing it myself, working around Helen's schedule so she could still cook dinner every night. I reached for the telephone on the side table, an old rotary model Helen had insisted we keep because she loved the weight of it in her hand. My fingers found Marcus's number without conscious thought muscle memory from years of calling him with questions about contracts and zoning issues. But I didn't dial. Instead, I sat with the receiver in my lap and thought about what I wanted to say. This wasn't about legal technicalities or property rights. This was about a son who no longer saw his father as a person worth considering, who viewed my life as an inconvenience to be managed rather than respected. The lake was black now, visible only as an absence of stars in my peripheral vision. Somewhere out there, a fish jumped the sound, carrying across the water like a small applause. Helen used to say the lake was never truly quiet, that if you listened carefully, you could hear all the life beneath the surface, the gentle movements of bass and bluegill, the whisper of underwater currents, the soft percussion of waves against the shore. I was learning to listen more carefully to everything now. Tomorrow I would call Marcus. Tomorrow I would begin to understand my options. But tonight I would sit in my wife's chair and remember what it felt like to build something worth protecting. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would not be moved from this place by anyone who mistook my grief for weakness or my solitude for surrender. The morning came gray and cold, October showing its teeth. I woke before dawn from dreams I couldn't quite remember, but the taste of unfinished business lingered in my mouth like bitter coffee. By 6 I was dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, the kind I'd used for decades to sketch out project timelines and material lists. At the top of the first page I wrote options. Below that, I began cataloging possibilities with the methodical precision I'd once used for construction estimates. legal consultation, property transfer, documentation, security measures. Each word felt like laying foundation stones, small individual actions that would support whatever came next. The phone rang at 7:30, jarring me from my planning. Ethan's number on the caller ID. Dad. His voice carried that same rehearsed casualness from yesterday. I hope we didn't upset you. We're just trying to be look out for everyone. I let the silence stretch, counting heartbeats. What do you need, Ethan? Need. He laughed, but it sounded forced. I don't need anything. I wanted to make sure you understood what we discussed. About the practical benefits of, I understood perfectly. Another pause. Madison thinks maybe we came on too strong. We could talk about a gradual transition. Maybe you could spend winters in the community summers here with us. That way, you'd have the best of both worlds. Us, as if he and I were still a team. The answer is still no, I said, his tone sharpened. Dad, you're being stubborn. This arrangement would benefit everyone. Gerald and Patricia need a place. You need people around who can help if something happens, and we need to know you're safe. Since when have you worried about my safety? Since Mom died, and you started living like a hermit out there. The accusation hung in the air. Living like a hermit, as if grief were a character flaw, as if the choice to honor my wife's memory and the place we'd shared made me somehow deficient. I'll think about it. I lied, because sometimes the only way to end a conversation is to give people what they think they want to hear. Good. That's all we're asking. Just think about it. After he hung up, I stared at the legal pad. Under options. I added a new category, timeline. If Ethan was pushing this hard this fast, he had reasons I didn't fully understand yet. Money troubles maybe, or pressure from Madison and her parents. Either way, I needed to move faster than they expected. At 9 o'clock sharp, I called Marcus Reed's office. Marcus, it's Richard Dalton. I need to see you today. It's about the lake property. What kind of about? His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to expect complications. The kind where family members think they can make decisions about what belongs to me. I can see you at 11. Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence rather than awe. His secretary, a woman named Dorothy, who'd worked for him longer than I'd known him, led me back to his corner office without the usual small talk. She understood the difference between social visits and business emergencies. Marcus stood when I entered, extending a hand that was firm without being aggressive. He was my age, maybe a year older, with the kind of sharp mind that had served him well in a career built on paying attention to details others missed. Coffee, he offered. Please. He poured from a carafe that looked like it had been brewing since the Carter administration, handed me a mug that was chipped but clean. We sat across from each other at his conference table, morning light slanting through windows that overlooked Main Street. Tell me what's happening, he said. I laid it out chronologically, Ethan's visit, the demand that I move the suggestion of senior communities, the casual way they'd discuss my life, as if it were a business problem to be solved. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad that matched mine. They can't force you to sell, he said when I finished. The house is yours, titled in your name alone since Helen's passing. But that doesn't mean they can't make your life difficult. How? Pressure tactics, emotional manipulation. In extreme cases, adult children have been known to claim their parents are no longer competent to make decisions about their own welfare. The words hit like cold water. They'd try to have me declared incompetent. I'm not saying they will. I'm saying it's a tool people sometimes use when other methods fail. It's hard to prove and harder to stick, especially if the alleged incompetent person has good legal representation. He smiled slightly. Which you do. What do I need to do? Document everything. Every conversation, every phone call, every interaction. If they're planning something more aggressive than family guilt, they'll show their hand eventually. Marcus opened a file drawer and pulled out several forms. We should also update your documentation. Power of attorney, healthcare directives, living will. Make sure everything is current and crystal clear. I spent the next hour going through paperwork, updating beneficiaries, clarifying my wishes for medical care and end-of-life decisions. It felt strange planning for my own decline, but also oddly liberating. These were my choices, my decisions about my own life. One more thing. Marcus said as we finished. Have you considered making it harder for them to contest your will or challenge your property ownership? How? A trust. Transfer ownership of the house to a revocable living trust with you as trustee. It accomplishes the same thing as outright ownership. You control everything during your lifetime, but it makes the property much harder to challenge or manipulate after your death. And if I want to sell, as trustee, you can do whatever you want with trust property. Think of it as insurance. I signed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon, authorizing Marcus to draw up the trust documents. Outside his office downtown felt different, sharper, more purposeful. The October air carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, the scent of seasons changing, whether you were ready or not. On the drive home, I stopped at Henderson's Hardware, a store where I'd bought supplies for countless projects over the years. Tom Henderson was behind the counter, as he had been for 40 years, his apron stained with the honest dirt of useful work. "Richard," he said, looking up from an invoice, "haven't seen you in a while. How are you managing getting by?" "Tom, I need some security equipment. Motion sensors, maybe a basic camera system." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Everything all right out at the lake?" "Probably, but I'd rather be careful than sorry." He led me to the back corner of the store where boxes of electronic equipment sat on metal shelving. "Most folks go wireless these days," he said, pulling down a package. "Easy to install, connects to your phone. I bought a basic system, 4 cameras, motion detectors, a central hub that would alert me to any unusual activity." Tom offered to install it, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself to understand completely. Back at the house, I spent the rest of the afternoon reading instruction manuals and planning camera placement. One overlooking the driveway, one focused on the front door, 2 covering the sides and back of the house. Nothing paranoid or excessive, just basic precautions any sensible homeowner might take. As I worked, I found myself thinking about chess games Helen and I used to play on winter evenings. She'd been the better player with an intuitive understanding of strategy that often caught me off guard. "You think too much about individual moves," she'd tell me. "Chess isn't about the next move. It's about the move after the move after the next move." I was thinking about that now. Ethan's opening gambit had been direct but clumsy, a frontal assault that revealed his intentions too clearly. Whatever came next would be more subtle, more carefully planned. I needed to be ready. The camera installation took most of the next morning. I mounted them high enough to avoid casual tampering, but positioned to capture clear images of anyone approaching the house. The motion sensors went near windows and doors, most likely to be used for unauthorized entry. When I finished, I tested the system from inside the house, watching myself on the phone screen as I walked the perimeter. It felt strange seeing my own property through the lens of suspicion, but Helen would have understood. She'd always been practical about protecting what mattered. That afternoon, I called my bank and scheduled a meeting with the manager. If Ethan was planning financial pressure, I wanted to understand my own position clearly. 25 years of steady income from my construction business had left me comfortable, if not wealthy. The house was paid off, my medical expenses were manageable, and I lived simply enough that my needs were modest. "You're in good shape, Richard," Janet Morrison told me as we reviewed my accounts. She'd been handling my banking for 15 years, had known Helen well enough to send flowers to the funeral. "Better than most people your age. I want to make sure no one else can access my accounts," I said. "No family members, no emergency contacts, just me." She looked up from the computer screen. "Is there a reason you're concerned about that?" I considered how much to tell her. Janet was trustworthy, discreet, but she was also part of a small community where gossip traveled fast. "Family complications," I said finally. "Nothing dramatic, but I want to be careful." She nodded and made notes in my file. "We can set up additional security measures, password requirements, verbal confirmation for any large transactions." Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control, not over other people or their decisions, but over my own circumstances, my own responses. For too long, I'd been reactive, letting grief and loneliness dictate my choices. Now, I was being proactive, building defenses, preparing for whatever came next. The late afternoon light was golden on the lake when I pulled into my driveway. A flock of geese passed overhead, their calls echoing across the water as they headed south for the winter. Change was coming. I could feel it in the cooling air, in the way shadows fell longer each day. But change didn't have to mean surrender. I spent the evening in my workshop not building anything specific, but simply enjoying the feel of tools in my hands, the satisfaction of precise work. Wood didn't lie or manipulate or guilt you into decisions you didn't want to make. It responded to patient, skillful attention with predictable results. As I worked, I thought about tomorrow's tasks. Marcus would have the trust documents ready for review by the end of the week. The security system would deter casual interference and document anything more serious. My finances were secure, my legal position strong, but most importantly, I was thinking clearly again. The fog of grief that had clouded my judgment for months was lifting, replaced by the sharp focus I'd once brought to complex construction projects. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as I put away my tools. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation or coercion. But tonight, for the first time since Helen's death, I felt ready for whatever came next. This was my house, my property, my choice. And I was done being pushed around by people who confused love with control. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 days after my meeting with Marcus. I was in the kitchen, scrambling eggs that would taste like cardboard. No matter how carefully I cooked them, grief had a way of leaching flavor from everything when my phone buzzed with a text message. "We're coming by at 2 p.m. to finalize arrangements. Please have your things ready." Ethan, not a request, not even a suggestion. A directive, as if my compliance were a foregone conclusion. I set down my fork and read the message again. The casual assumption that I would simply pack up my life and hand over the keys made something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't about helping me anymore, if it ever had been. This was about removing an obstacle. I texted back, "No." The response came within minutes. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I turned off my phone and finished my breakfast in silence. At exactly 2 o'clock, I watched from the living room window as 2 vehicles pulled into my driveway. Ethan's SUV followed by a white moving van with Clearwater Senior Living emblazoned on the side. My stomach dropped. They'd already made arrangements, already assumed my surrender. Ethan climbed out first, followed by Madison and her parents. A man in coveralls emerged from the moving truck, clipboard in hand. They walked toward my front door with the confident stride of people who expected no resistance. I opened the door before they could knock. "Hello, Ethan." He brushed past me without invitation, the others following. "Dad, we brought some people to help with the transition. Make it easier on everyone." The man with the clipboard stepped forward. "Mr. Dalton, I'm Jim from Clearwater Moving Services. We're here to help relocate your belongings to your new apartment. Beautiful place, you're going to love it." "I'm not moving," I said quietly. Jim looked confused, glancing between me and Ethan. "I'm sorry. There's been a misunderstanding," Ethan said smoothly. "My father's having some difficulty accepting the change. It's natural at his age." At his age, as if being 70 meant I'd lost the capacity for rational thought. Gerald stepped forward, consulting a folder. "Richard, we've taken care of everything. First month's rent, security deposit, even arranged for meal delivery. You won't have to worry about anything." "Because I'm not going anywhere." Madison's smile never wavered, but her voice took on an edge. "Richard, we've discussed this. The arrangement is better for everyone. You'll have professional care, social activities. And you'll have my house." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Gerald cleared his throat. Even the moving man seemed to sense the tension, taking a step back toward the door. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with a difficult child, "we're trying to help you. Can't you see that? Help me, what disappear conveniently." His jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable." "Am I?" I walked to Helen's desk and pulled out the deed, the one I'd been studying for days. "This document says the house belongs to me, bought and paid for with money I earned. Are you disputing that?" "No, but..." "Then what gives you the right to decide where I live?" Ethan's composure cracked slightly. "You can't take care of this place anymore. It's too much for one person, especially someone your age. What if you fall? What if you have another heart attack? Then I'll deal with it. How? Who's going to find you if something happens? Who's going to..." "That's my risk to take." The moving man cleared his throat. Should we wait in the truck?" "Yes," I said firmly. "You should leave." Ethan's face flushed. "Dad, these people have schedules. We've made commitments. You can't just watch me." I walked to the front door and held it open. The moving man didn't need further encouragement. He nodded apologetically and headed for his truck. I could hear the engine start, then the crunch of gravel as the van backed out of my driveway. When I turned back, 4 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to fury. "You've embarrassed us," Madison said, her carefully maintained composure finally slipping. "We had to put down deposits, make arrangements. You made arrangements for my life without asking me. That's not my embarrassment to carry." Gerald stepped forward, his businessman's smile strained. "Richard, let's be adults about this. We all want what's best. Do we? Because what's best for me is staying in my own home. What's best for you is getting rid of me so you can move in. Those aren't the same thing." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "You're being selfish. Mom would be ashamed of how you're acting." The mention of Helen was a line crossed, a weapon pulled from a sheath. For a moment the room went very quiet. "Your mother," I said, my voice deadly calm, "would be ashamed of a son who tried to evict his father from the home she loved. She would be heartbroken to see what you've become." The words hit their mark. Ethan stepped back as if I'd struck him physically. Madison's mouth opened, then closed. Gerald and Patricia looked toward the door, as if calculating escape routes. "Get out," I said quietly. "Dad, now." They filed out in silence, their expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. I watched from the window as they climbed back into the SUV, their body language stiff with defeat and resentment. Ethan sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, his face pale and set. As they drove away, I noticed Gerald speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing, planning their next move, no doubt. People like that didn't give up easily when they wanted something. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, my hands steadier than they had been in days. The house felt different, not just empty, but claimed, like territory that had been defended and held. But I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. If anything, it was just beginning. That evening, Marcus called with an update. "The trust documents are ready for your signature. But, Richard, there's something else you should know. I had lunch with Bob Peterson today. He handles real estate for several of the larger firms in town. Someone's been making inquiries about lake properties, specifically asking about yours." "What kind of inquiries?" "Market value, comparable sales, potential development opportunities. Might be nothing, but the timing seems coincidental." I thought about Gerald's calculating gaze, the way he'd studied my living room like an appraiser. They're not giving up. Probably not, which is why I think we should move quickly on the trust. Once that property is transferred, it becomes much harder for anyone to challenge your ownership or force a sale. "How quickly?" "I can have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon. All you need to do is sign." The next morning, I drove to Marcus's office and put my signature on documents that would change everything. As trustee of the Richard Dalton Family Trust, I would retain complete control over the property during my lifetime. But legally, the house would no longer be mine to lose in any family dispute or competency challenge. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as we finished. "Given what you've told me about your son's behavior, I think you should consider updating your will as well. Make your intentions crystal clear." I thought about that on the drive home. The will Helen and I had made together left everything to Ethan, assuming he would honor our memory and protect what we'd built. But the man who'd tried to evict me from my own home wasn't the son we'd raised. He was someone else entirely. That afternoon, I sat in Helen's garden with a fresh legal pad, writing out my thoughts about the future, about what should happen to this place if I were no longer here to protect it. The roses were still blooming their late-season flowers, smaller but more intensely colored, as if they knew winter was coming and were determined to make their final statement. Helen would have understood what I was doing. She'd always been practical about protecting what mattered. Some people, she used to say, mistake kindness for weakness. It's important to show them the difference. As the sun set over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and copper, I made my decision. This house would not go to someone who saw it as a commodity to be liquidated. It would go to people who understood what a home truly meant. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times as I finished writing. Tomorrow I would call Marcus again. Tomorrow I would begin the final phase of protecting everything Helen and I had built together. But tonight I would sit in the place we'd chosen to grow old together, surrounded by the memories we'd made and the garden she'd planted, and feel grateful for the chance to defend what we loved. The fight wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time since Ethan's visit, I felt like I held the stronger hand. And I intended to play it perfectly. The envelope arrived on a Saturday morning, slipped under my door, sometime before dawn. No postmark, no return address, just my name written in block letters across cream-colored paper. Inside was a single sheet with a brief message typed in Times New Roman, Mr. Dalton. You should know that arrangements have been made for your care whether you cooperate or not. Some decisions are too important to leave to stubborn old men. The family will do what's necessary. I read it twice, then walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the lake. The water was mirror still reflecting the pale morning sky. Helen's garden showed the first touches of frost on the marigolds, but the roses she'd trained up the trellis were still blooming defiant against the coming winter. The note was unsigned, but I didn't need a signature to know its source. The phrase "stubborn old men" had Madison written all over it. This wasn't Ethan's style. He still had enough residual guilt to avoid direct threats. But his wife and her parents had no such restraint. I called Marcus immediately. "They're escalating," I told him, reading the note over the phone. "Anonymous threats are a sign of desperation," Marcus said. "They're running out of legitimate options and moving toward intimidation, which frankly works in our favor." "How?" "Because it documents their intent to coerce you. Keep that note. If this goes legal, it's evidence." After we hung up, I made myself breakfast and sat at the kitchen table with a fresh legal pad. At the top of the page I wrote, "Assets and Vulnerabilities." Below that, I began cataloging everything I owned, everything that might be at risk, the house and property obviously. My bank account's modest but sufficient. The remaining equipment from my construction business stored in a rented warehouse downtown. Helen's jewelry not valuable by auction standards, but priceless to me. The 1967 Mustang in the garage, the one I'd restored for Ethan's 16th birthday, and bought back from him 3 years later when he'd needed quick cash. But as I wrote, I realized something important. My greatest vulnerability wasn't what I owned. It was my isolation. An old man living alone, no close family, except the ones trying to remove him. It was exactly the scenario that made competency challenges successful. I needed allies. People who could testify to my mental clarity, my ability to manage my own affairs. The problem was, I'd become something of a hermit since Helen's death, maintaining cordial relationships with neighbors, but keeping most people at arm's length. That would have to change. I started with Tom Henderson at the hardware store. When I stopped by that afternoon to pick up weather stripping for the back door, I lingered at the counter longer than usual. "Tom, you've known me for 15 years? At least, why? If someone asked you about my mental state, what would you say?" He looked up from the receipt he was writing, his expression suddenly serious. "I'd say you're sharp as ever. Handle your own business, pay your bills on time, never seemed confused about anything. Why someone questioning that? Family complications." Tom nodded slowly. "Seen it before. Kids get impatient, start thinking they know better than their parents. Hell, my own daughter tried to talk me into selling this place last year, moving to one of those retirement communities." He tapped the counter with his pen. "You need someone to vouch for you. You call me." By the end of the week, I'd had similar conversations with Janet at the bank, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd been my physician for 12 years, and even Father Murphy at St. Mary's, though I hadn't been to Mass since Helen's funeral. Each promised to document our interactions to be available if testimony were needed about my competency. But I was also making other preparations. Marcus had completed the trust documents, and I'd signed them in his office on a gray Thursday morning. Legally, the house now belonged to the Richard Dalton Family Trust, with me as sole trustee. The change was invisible to casual observation, but created a legal fortress around my property. "There's one more step we should consider," Marcus said as we finished. "Have you thought about what happens to the property if something happens to you?" I had been thinking about it, a lot. "Not Ethan," I said firmly. "I assume not. Charity, other family. I want to research some options first." That weekend, I drove to the Veterans Administration office in Springfield. The parking lot was half full of pickup trucks and older sedans, the vehicles of men who'd served their country and were now navigating the bureaucracy of aging. Inside, I spoke with a counselor named David Kim, a young man with patient eyes and the kind of careful attention that suggested he had heard every story before. "I'm looking into options for donating property," I told him. "Specifically lakefront acreage that might be useful for veteran programs." His eyes lit up. "There's always need for that kind of facility. Retreats, therapy programs, transitional housing. How much land are we talking about? 43 acres with a house garage and outbuildings, direct lake access. David whistled softly. That would be significant, life-changing for our programs. I left with a folder full of information about veteran-focused charities, organizations that turn donated properties into healing centers for men and women returning from overseas. The idea felt right in a way I hadn't expected. This place had healed me after Helen's death. Maybe it could heal others too. Monday morning brought another envelope, this one with a return address, Clearwater Senior Living Community. Inside was a glossy brochure and a letter from the director warmly welcoming me to their caring family and outlining the exciting activities and amenities I would enjoy. At the bottom, handwritten in blue ink, "Your son has taken care of everything. We look forward to meeting you soon. Margaret Stevens, Director." I called the number on the letterhead. "Clearwater Senior. Living, this is Margaret. Miss Stevens, this is Richard Dalton. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "Oh, Mr. Dalton, how wonderful to hear from you. Your son spoke so lovingly about you. We have a beautiful room ready, and I know you're going to love our community." "I'm not moving to your community." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry. I never applied to live there. I never signed any paperwork. My son had no authority to make arrangements on my behalf. But he put down a deposit. He said you were excited about the move, that you'd been struggling with depression since your wife passed." The conversation that followed was uncomfortable for both of us. Margaret Stevens seemed genuinely confused, even hurt, as if I were rejecting not just her facility, but her personal kindness. I tried to be gentle but firm. No, I wasn't moving. No, I hadn't authorized any payments. Yes, she should refund my son's money immediately. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: fury. Not the hot, quick anger of a moment, but the cold, sustained rage that comes from being systematically undermined. Ethan hadn't just been pressuring me. He'd been telling strangers I was depressed, incompetent, unable to care for myself. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Helen's funeral. I put on my best suit, the charcoal gray one she'd bought me for our 30th anniversary. I combed my hair, polished my shoes, and drove to Ethan's office. His consulting firm occupied half a floor in a glass building, downtown, the kind of place where young people in expensive clothes moved quickly between conference rooms. The receptionist, a woman barely out of college, looked up when I approached her desk. "I'm here to see Ethan Dalton. Do you have an appointment? I'm his father." She made a quick phone call, speaking in hushed tones. When she hung up, her smile was apologetic. "He's in a meeting. Would you like to wait? I'll wait." 20 minutes later, Ethan emerged from a conference room, followed by 2 other men in suits. When he saw me, his step faltered. He said something to his colleagues, then walked over. "Dad, this is unexpected. We need to talk." He glanced around the reception area, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe we could grab coffee somewhere." "Here is fine." He led me to a small office that might have been a glorified closet, closing the door behind us. The space was sterile, anonymous, nothing personal except a single photo of him and Madison at their wedding. "I got a call from Clearwater Senior Living today," I said without preamble. His face went pale. "Dad, you told them I was depressed, incompetent, unable to care for myself. I was trying to help. You were trying to lie me into compliance." He sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. For a moment, he looked like the boy I remembered caught in a mistake and searching for a way out. "The deposit is refundable," he said quietly. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "The point is that you've stopped seeing me as your father and started seeing me as a problem to be solved. The point is that you're willing to lie about my mental state to strangers. The point is that you've forgotten who raised you." He looked up, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been shame. "I worry about you, Dad, living out there alone, not talking to anyone. That's my choice to make. Is it? Or is it just grief making you afraid to live?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Maybe there was truth in it. Maybe I had been hiding from life since Helen's death. But that didn't give him the right to make decisions for me. "I'm 70 years old," I said. "I've earned the right to live however I choose, in whatever house I choose, with whatever level of risk I'm willing to accept." I stood to leave, then paused at the door. The next time you want to discuss my living arrangements, call me directly. Stop going around me, stop lying about me, and stop making deposits for things I didn't ask for. I left him sitting in that sterile office, and I didn't look back. The drive home took me past the cemetery where Helen was buried. On impulse, I pulled into the gravel parking area and walked to her grave. The headstone was simple granite with her name dates and the inscription we'd chosen together, beloved wife and partner in all things. I'm fighting for us, I told her quietly, for what we built together. The late afternoon light slanted through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the well-tended grass. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed its way across another section of the cemetery, maintaining the peace of this place where so many stories had ended. But my story wasn't over yet, and I was finally ready to write the next chapter myself. The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday, handwritten on Madison's expensive stationery. "Richard, we'd love to have you join us for a family dinner this Saturday at 6 p.m. It's time we put our differences aside and found a solution that works for everyone. Love, Madison, and Ethan." I read it twice, studying the careful penmanship, the diplomatic phrasing. This wasn't a social invitation, it was a negotiation disguised as reconciliation. They'd regrouped after my visit to Ethan's office, developed a new strategy. The question was, what were they planning? I called Marcus that afternoon. "They want one more meeting," I told him, "at Saturday dinner. Are you going?" "I think so, but I want everything finalized before then. The trust, the new will, all of it. That's cutting it close. The charitable organization's paperwork alone. Then we'd better work fast." For the next 3 days, Marcus and I moved with the efficiency of a construction crew racing against weather. The trust was already complete, the house legally transferred beyond anyone's reach. But the new will required more delicate work, identifying the right veterans organization, establishing the terms of the donation, ensuring everything would be ironclad if challenged. We settled on the Lake County Veterans Retreat Foundation, a nonprofit that operated therapeutic programs for combat veterans. David Kim helped facilitate the paperwork, his enthusiasm infectious as he described what they could do with lakefront property. "Imagine," he said during our Thursday meeting, "quiet spaces for guys dealing with PTSD, fishing therapy programs, a place where families can reconnect away from the noise of the world." It felt right. Helen would have approved. She'd always believed in helping people heal. By Friday afternoon, everything was signed and recorded. If something happened to me, the house and property would go to people who understood what sanctuary meant. Ethan would inherit my financial accounts and personal property, but not the one thing he'd tried to take by force. Saturday arrived gray and cold, November asserting itself with authority. I dressed carefully, the same suit I'd worn to Ethan's office, but with a different tie, one Helen had given me for Christmas years ago. Dark blue silk with a subtle pattern that caught the light when I moved. I arrived at Ethan's house precisely at 6. Madison answered the door wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly expenses. "Richard, I'm so glad you came." The living room had been staged for the occasion. Soft lighting, fresh flowers, the good china set out on the dining table. Gerald and Patricia sat on the sofa, looking expectant. Ethan emerged from the kitchen, carrying a bottle of wine, his movements careful and deliberate. "Dad," he said, "thank you for coming." They seated me at the head of the table, the position of honor, or perhaps the position where I'd be most vulnerable to collective pressure. The meal was elaborate roast beef potatoes, vegetables that had been arranged more for appearance than convenience. Madison played hostess with professional skill-keeping glasses filled and conversation flowing. For the first hour, we talked about safe subjects, the weather, local news, memories of holidays past. It felt almost normal, like the family dinners Helen used to insist upon. But underneath the pleasantries, I could sense the tension building, the careful orchestration of whatever was coming next. Finally, over dessert, Gerald cleared his throat. "Richard, we wanted to talk about finding a path forward, something that addresses everyone's concerns." "I'm listening." Madison leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We realize we may have come on too strong before. Nobody wants to force you into anything you're not comfortable with." Ethan nodded. "We've been thinking about alternatives. What if we modified the house instead of moving you? Added a small apartment in the garage or converted part of the basement. Gerald and I would be right there if you needed anything," Patricia added. But you'd maintain your independence, your privacy. I sipped my coffee considering their proposal. It was cleverly constructed, addressing my stated objections while still achieving their primary goal of moving in. They'd probably rehearsed this presentation, assigned roles, anticipated counter-arguments. "That's very thoughtful," I said finally. They relaxed visibly, mistaking my politeness for capitulation. "We could start the renovations right after the holidays," Madison continued. "Gerald knows some excellent contractors. Of course we'd need to update the ownership documentation," Gerald added casually. "Add Madison and Ethan to the deed for insurance purposes, estate planning, that sort of thing." There it was. The real objective delivered with the practiced smoothness of a man who'd closed many deals. They didn't just want to live in my house, they wanted to own it. "Actually," I said, setting down my coffee cup, "there's something you should know about the ownership situation." 4 pairs of eyes focused on me with sudden intensity. "I've made some changes recently, legal changes." Ethan's smile faltered. "What kind of changes?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. Marcus had prepared copies of the trust documents, the new will, the donation paperwork. I set it on the table between the dessert plates and coffee cups. "The house no longer belongs to me," I said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Gerald reached for the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Patricia's face went pale. Madison's carefully constructed composure cracked like ice under pressure. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean that as of last Friday, the property belongs to the Richard Dalton Family Trust. I'm the trustee, which means I control it completely during my lifetime. But legally, it's no longer mine to give away or have taken from me." Gerald was scanning the documents, his businessman's eyes moving quickly over the legal language. This is irrevocable? Completely. But after you die?" Madison's voice was sharp, desperate. I pulled out another document, a copy of my new will. "After I die, the property goes to the Lake County Veterans Retreat Foundation. They'll use it as a therapeutic facility for combat veterans." The explosion of protests that followed was immediate and chaotic. Ethan shouted about family loyalty. Madison accused me of spite and manipulation. Gerald demanded to know if the transfers could be challenged. Patricia simply stared at the papers, as if they might change if she willed it hard enough. I let them exhaust themselves, sitting calmly while their careful dinner party dissolved into accusations and recriminations. When the noise finally died down, I spoke into the sudden quiet. "For 32 years, this house was a home that Helen and I built together. Every board, every nail, every choice was made with love and intention. You wanted to turn it into a commodity, something to be divided up for convenience and profit. We're family," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Family doesn't try to evict family. Family doesn't lie to strangers about mental competency. Family doesn't make deposits at senior facilities without permission." I stood straightening my tie, Helen's tie. "The house will go to people who understand what sanctuary means. People who've earned the right to heal in a place of peace." "You can't do this," Madison said, her composure completely gone now. "We've made plans, investments. You made assumptions. There's a difference." I walked toward the door, then paused. "Ethan, you were right about one thing. It was time for me to stop hiding from life. So I'm going to start living it again in my own house, on my own terms, for as long as I'm able." "Dad, wait!" But I was already gone, walking out into the November night toward my truck. Behind me, I could hear voices rising again, angry, desperate, calculating what could still be salvaged from their ruined plans. The drive home took me past the lake, where moonlight painted the water silver. The temperature was dropping. There might be frost by morning, but the roses in Helen's garden were still blooming stubborn and beautiful in the face of coming winter. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment looking at the house we'd built together. Light spilled from the windows onto the porch, where we'd shared so many quiet evenings. The place looked the same as always, but something fundamental had changed. It was truly mine now, not because any document said so, but because I'd fought for it, defended it, proven that some things are worth more than convenience or profit or family peace. Inside, I hung up my jacket and loosened Helen's tie. The grandfather clock chimed 7:30, marking another day in a life that was finally completely my own again. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Helen's favorite chair, watching the last light fade from the sky over the lake. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Ethan might try legal action, though Marcus assured me the trust was bulletproof. Madison and her parents would have to find somewhere else to live, solve their problems without using me as a solution. But tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in the house we'd chosen, surrounded by the memories we'd made, protected by decisions I'd made with a clear mind and a determined heart. The phone rang once around 8 o'clock. Ethan's number. I let it go to voicemail. Some conversations were finished whether the other party realized it or not. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of possibility of mornings that would unfold without manipulation of decisions that would be mine alone to make. I woke the next day to sunlight streaming through bedroom windows that Helen had positioned to catch the dawn, and for the first time in months, I felt no weight pressing on my chest. The coffee tasted better. The eggs I scrambled for breakfast had flavor again. Even the October air sharp with the promise of winter seemed cleaner as I stood on the back porch watching the lake accept the morning light. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Ethan and 2 from Madison. I deleted the voicemails without listening. Whatever arguments they wanted to make, whatever promises or threats they thought might change my mind, belonged to yesterday's conversation. Today was about something else entirely. I spent the morning in Helen's garden, cutting back the perennials that had finished their season, preparing the beds for winter. My hands remembered the work, the careful attention she'd taught me to pay to each plant's needs. Some required complete cutting back. Others needed their seed heads left standing to feed the birds through the cold months. Like people, she used to say. Some need a complete fresh start. Others need to keep something of themselves standing through the hard times. Around noon, a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. I watched from the garden as a young man in military dress uniform stepped out, followed by an older woman in civilian clothes. David Kim from the VA office and someone I hadn't met. "Mr. Dalton," David called, raising his hand in greeting. "I hope we're not intruding. This is Patricia Wells from the Veterans Retreat Foundation." Patricia was perhaps 60 with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that carried the particular gravity of someone who'd spent years helping people rebuild their lives. Her handshake was firm, direct. "Mr. Dalton, David told me about your generous donation. I wanted to come see the property myself, understand what we'll be working with." I led them through the house, watching Patricia's face as she took in the layout, the natural light, the views of the lake from every window. In the living room, she paused before the stone fireplace, running her hand along the mantel I'd carved from a single piece of oak. "This is remarkable," she said. "The craftsmanship, the attention to detail. You built this yourself." "Most of it, my wife designed it. I executed her vision." We walked down to the dock, where Patricia stood for a long moment watching the water. The lake was calm, reflecting pine trees and sky with perfect clarity. "We have men and women who haven't seen peace in years," she said quietly. "Places like this, they remember what they're fighting to protect." David pulled out a tablet making notes about the property's potential. The main house could accommodate 6 to 8 residents at a time. The garage could be converted to workshop space for therapy programs. And this dock, he gestured toward the water. Fishing therapy is incredibly effective for PTSD treatment. I found myself smiling, imagining the house filled with purpose again. People healing instead of scheming, building instead of taking. "There's one condition," I said. They both turned to me, suddenly serious. "I'd like to retain lifetime use of the property, not ownership that goes to you completely, but the right to continue living here, to be part of whatever you create." Patricia's expression softened. "Mr. Dalton, that would be wonderful. Having someone with your knowledge of the property, your connection to it, that's invaluable." We spent another hour walking the grounds discussing possibilities. When they left, Patricia shook my hand again, her grip warm with genuine gratitude. "This gift will change lives," she said. "Thank you for trusting us with it." That evening, I called Marcus to finalize the lifetime use clause. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Living with a bunch of strangers, even therapeutic ones. They won't be strangers for long, and Helen always said this house was meant to heal people. Now it will." The first real test came 3 days later, when Ethan arrived unannounced. I was in the workshop sanding a piece of maple I'd been planning to turn into a jewelry box, not for anyone in particular, just for the satisfaction of making something beautiful from raw wood. He knocked on the workshop door, his expensive suit looking out of place among the sawhorses and power tools. "Dad, we need to talk." I didn't stop sanding. Do we? You can't just give away my inheritance. I didn't give away your inheritance. I gave away my property. There's a difference. He stepped into the workshop, careful not to brush against anything that might mark his clothes. That property was supposed to come to me, to my children when Madison and I have them. Was it? I set down the sandpaper and really looked at him. Because the way you've acted, I wasn't sure you wanted it. You seem more interested in getting rid of me than preserving anything we built here. His face flushed. I was trying to take care of you. By lying about my mental state, by making arrangements without my knowledge, by bringing strangers to pack up my life. You were isolating yourself, becoming a hermit. I was grieving. There's a difference, though, apparently not one you recognize. He leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking older, more tired. Madison's parents have nowhere to go. Their lease is really up, Dad. They're not lying about that. That's unfortunate. It's also not my problem to solve. But we're family. Family. I interrupted. Doesn't try to evict family from their home. Family doesn't make plans around you without including you in the conversation. Family respects boundaries. The workshop fell quiet except for the whisper of wind through the pine trees outside. Somewhere on the lake, a loon called that wild, lonely sound that Helen had loved. Is there any way to fix this? Ethan asked, finally, his voice small. I considered the question seriously. Was there? Could we rebuild something from the wreckage of trust and respect that littered the space between us? Maybe, I said, finally. But it would require you to see me as your father again, not as an obstacle to be managed. It would require honesty instead of manipulation. And it would require accepting that I have the right to make my own decisions about my own life. He nodded slowly. I can try. Trying isn't enough. Doing is what matters. We talked for another 20 minutes carefully, like people defusing a bomb. He apologized for the senior living arrangements, for the lies about my competency, for treating me like a problem instead of a person. I accepted the apologies without offering immediate forgiveness. Trust once broken had to be rebuilt with actions, not words. When he left, I felt cautiously optimistic, not about reclaiming what we'd lost that was probably gone forever, but about the possibility of building something new, something honest from what remained. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Patricia and her team visited twice more, developing plans for the conversion. The main house would remain largely unchanged. It's perfect as it is, Patricia insisted. The garage would become a workshop for woodworking and metal fabrication therapy. A small cabin would be built near the lake for individual counseling sessions. I found myself looking forward to the changes to the sound of voices and purposeful activity that would soon fill these rooms. Helen would have loved it, the house serving its deepest purpose as a place of healing and renewal. Ethan called twice-a-week short conversations that gradually grew more natural. He was seeing a counselor, he told me, trying to understand how his relationship with money and status had corrupted his judgment. Madison was less receptive to change, but she'd stopped calling me directly, which felt like progress. Gerald and Patricia Monroe found a rental in town, nothing as grand as they had hoped for, but adequate for their needs. I felt no satisfaction in their reduced circumstances, only a quiet relief that their problems were no longer considered mine to solve. December arrived with the first real snow, covering the lake property in a blanket of pristine white. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the flakes drift down like Helen's blessings. The house felt different now, not empty, but expectant, waiting for its next chapter to begin. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another morning in a life that had found its footing again. Soon this place would echo with new voices, new stories, new attempts at healing, but for now, it was perfectly peacefully mine. I raised my coffee mug toward Helen's photograph on the mantel. We did it, I said softly. We kept what mattered. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden she'd planted, the dock. We'd shared the life we'd built together. Change was coming, change I'd chosen, change that honored what we'd created rather than destroying it. And for the first time since her death, that felt like enough. The lake lay still beneath its covering of snow, holding the winter light like a promise. Spring would come again, bringing new growth to Helen's garden and new residents to her house. But winter had its own peace, its own purpose in the cycle of seasons. I was learning to trust that cycle again, the rhythm of endings and beginnings, of holding on and letting go, of defending what matters and releasing what no longer serves. The snow fell quietly, and I was content to watch it come. Spring arrived late that year, holding back like it wasn't quite sure of its welcome. The snow lingered through March, then finally surrendered to April rains that washed the last white patches from the shadows under the pine trees. Helen's garden emerged slowly, cautiously pushing green shoots through soil that still remembered winter's grip. I was on my knees beside the rosebed working compost into the earth when the first van arrived. Not the moving van that had tried to take my life away, but a white passenger van with Lake County Veterans Retreat Foundation printed in blue letters on the side. Patricia Wells emerged from the driver's seat, followed by 3 men and 2 women in casual clothes, our first residents. I stood brushing dirt from my knees, suddenly aware of how I must look 70 years old, in mud-stained work pants and a flannel shirt older than some of these veterans. But Patricia's smile was warm as she made introductions. "Everyone, this is Richard Dalton. He built this house with his wife Helen, and he's graciously allowing us to share it." The veterans Tom, Marcus, Sarah, Diego, and Jennifer nodded with the particular wariness of people who'd learned not to trust too quickly. Tom was maybe 40, with a beard that couldn't quite hide the scar along his jaw. Sarah looked younger, her eyes constantly scanning cataloging exits and potential threats, even as she smiled politely. They were all wounded in ways that didn't always show on the surface. "Welcome," I said simply. "The house is ready for you." Over the next few hours, I watched them settle in. Patricia had been right about the space. The 3 upstairs bedrooms and 2 downstairs guest rooms provided private quarters for each resident, while the common areas encouraged community. The kitchen, where Helen had insisted on a large farmhouse table, became an immediate gathering place. Tom gravitated toward the workshop in the garage, his hands already assessing the tools I'd organized on pegboards. "This is incredible," he said, running his fingers along the handle of a well-worn hand plane. "My grandfather had tools like these." "They're here to be used," I told him. "Wood doesn't judge, doesn't rush you. Sometimes that's what healing needs, something that responds to patient attention." The first few days were an adjustment for all of us. The house had been so quiet for so long that even normal sounds, footsteps on the stairs, voices in conversation, the clatter of dishes being washed, felt foreign. But slowly rhythms emerged. Coffee at 6, breakfast at 7, then people dispersing to their various therapies and activities. Patricia had hired a cook, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, who treated the kitchen like sacred ground. She quickly learned that I liked my coffee, black my eggs scrambled dry, and that I needed quiet time in the early mornings before the day's bustle began. "You're adjusting well," Patricia told me, during one of her weekly visits 3 weeks into the program. We stood on the dock watching Diego fish with patient concentration. "It's different," I admitted. "But good different. The house feels alive again." "And you? How are you feeling about everything that happened with your son?" I considered the question. Ethan and I had settled into a cautious day-teen weekly phone calls that avoided difficult subjects, occasional lunch meetings in town where we talked about weather and sports and anything that didn't require trust or vulnerability. "I'm learning that you can love someone and still need distance from them," I said finally. "My son made choices that showed me who he'd become. Now I'm making choices about who I want to be going forward." Diego caught something, not a keeper, but the act of catching and releasing seemed to satisfy him. He looked toward us and nodded a small acknowledgement of shared humanity in that simple moment of respect for life. The workshop became the heart of our healing. Tom discovered a talent for carving his scarred hands, creating delicate birds and animals from blocks of basswood. Sarah built bookshelves with a precision that spoke to her military training, each joint, perfect, each measurement, exact. Diego crafted fishing lures, tiny works of art designed to dance through water. I found myself teaching again, showing Tom how to sharpen a chisel, helping Sarah understand wood grain, demonstrating for Diego the patient sanding that brought out the beauty in a piece of cherry. They learned quickly, hungry for the kind of accomplishment that didn't involve weapons or violence. "Why do you do this?" Sarah asked one afternoon, watching me smooth a piece of maple that would become the side of a jewelry box. "Because making something beautiful proves that destruction isn't the only option," I said. "Because wood holds possibility, and sometimes we need to be reminded that we do too." She nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. Summer brought more changes. The small cabin by the lake was completed, a simple structure with large windows overlooking the water, where residents could meet with counselors in privacy and peace. The garden that Helen had planted became a meditation space, residents spending quiet hours among the roses and daylilies, finding their own rhythm in the cycle of growth and bloom. Ethan came to visit in July, his first time at the house since everything had changed. I saw him pull up in the driveway from the workshop. Window saw him sit in his car for several minutes before finally getting out. Tom and Sarah were at the workbench focused on their projects, but I noticed them tracking the stranger with peripheral awareness. "My son," I explained quietly. "First visit since we turned the place into a retreat." Tom nodded. "Want us to disappear?" "No, this is your home too now. He needs to see that." Ethan walked into the workshop tentatively, like a man entering territory he no longer recognized. His expensive suit looked ridiculous among the sawdust and wood shavings, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the concrete floor. "Dad," he said, "the place looks different. It's being used the way it was meant to be used." He nodded, then seemed to notice Tom and Sarah for the first time. "I'm Ethan, Richard's son." "Tom," came the reply, brief but not unfriendly. Sarah just nodded, her focus apparently on the dovetail joint she was cutting. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Ethan cleared his throat. "Could we talk? Maybe take a walk?" We walked down to the lake, following the path Helen had insisted on creating through the wildflowers she'd encouraged to grow. The afternoon sun was warm on our shoulders, and dragonflies darted over the water's surface like living jewels. "Madison and I are separating," Ethan said abruptly. I absorbed this news in silence, waiting for more. She couldn't accept that the house was really gone, kept talking about legal challenges, about finding ways to contest the trust. I finally realized she was more in love with the idea of this place than she was with me. "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. Despite everything, I'd never wanted to see my son's marriage fail. "Are you—" His voice carried an edge. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To punish me." We'd reached the dock. I sat on the weathered boards, dangling my feet over the water. After a moment, Ethan joined me. "I didn't want to punish you," I said carefully. "I wanted to protect what your mother and I built. There's a difference." "Is there, because it feels like you chose strangers over your own son?" I looked at him, really looked at him. The silver at his temples had spread, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. My son was getting older, carrying his own burdens, facing his own losses. "I chose purpose over convenience," I said. "I chose healing over possession. And yes, I chose people who saw this place as sanctuary over people who saw it as real estate." He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water, watching the ripples spread. "I talked to my therapist about you, about us. She said I never learned to see you as a whole person, just as a father figure who was supposed to solve my problems. And now I'm trying to understand that you're a man who lost his wife, fought for his home, and chose to share it with people who needed it more than I did." He paused. "It's hard to accept, but I'm trying." We sat in silence for a while, watching the lake hold the afternoon light. A loon called from somewhere across the water, that wild, lonely sound that had become a kind of anthem for this place. "Do you think Mom would approve?" Ethan asked finally. "Of what you've done?" I thought about Helen, about her fierce love for this place, and her fiercer belief in healing and purpose. I think she'd have done it herself if she'd had the chance. Your mother believed empty rooms were a sin when people needed shelter, empty tables, a crime when people needed feeding, and empty hearts, those too. We walked back to the house together, our conversation lighter, now easier. At his car, Ethan paused. "Could I come back sometime? Not to challenge anything, just to visit?" "You're always welcome," I said. "As long as you understand this isn't your house to inherit anymore. It's a shared space, a healing space." "I understand, and Dad, thank you for fighting for what mattered, even when it meant fighting me." After he left, I returned to the workshop. Tom and Sarah had made progress on their projects, a carved eagle emerging from Tom's basewood, Sarah's bookshelf taking shape with military precision. "Everything okay?" Tom asked without looking up from his carving. "Getting there," I said, one conversation at a time. By autumn, the retreat had found its rhythm. New residents came, as others graduated from the program, moving on to jobs and apartments, and lives reclaimed from trauma's grip. Each departure was bittersweet proof of healing, but also loss of connection, formed in the crucible of shared recovery. Diego left in September, taking with him a tackle box full of lures he'd crafted and a confidence in his ability to create beauty that would serve him well in the furniture restoration business he was starting. Sarah followed in October, her apartment already furnished with bookshelves she'd built herself, each one a testament to precision reclaimed from chaos. Tom stayed longer, finding in the workshop a calling he'd never expected. By November, he was teaching new residents the same skills I'd taught him, passing on the knowledge that wood could heal. That patient attention to craft could quiet the loudest demons. "You should get paid for this," Patricia told him during a program review. "I am being paid," Tom replied, "just not in money." Christmas approached, and I prepared the house the way Helen and I always had: lights along the roofline, a wreath on the door, a tree in the corner of the living room. But this year, the decorations were hung by multiple hands, the tree trimmed by veterans who'd forgotten what peace looked like until they'd found it here. On Christmas Eve, we gathered around the fireplace I'd built by hand 30 years ago. 7 residents current, 3 staff members, and me, an unlikely family, bound by shared purpose rather than blood. Tom led us in a carol, his voice rough but sincere. Sarah read from a book of poetry she had been writing, her words capturing the slow transformation from soldier to civilian. A new resident named Michael, so fresh from deployment that he still startled at sudden sounds, simply sat and absorbed the warmth of community. Later, alone in my room, I pulled out the box of ornaments Helen and I had collected over the years. Each one told a story: the hand-blown glass ball from our trip to Michigan, the wooden snowflake Ethan had made in 2nd grade, the angel that had topped our tree for 3 decades. I hung the angel on my windowsill where I could see it from bed, where it could watch over not just me, but the house full of people sleeping under this roof. People who'd found their way here through pain and loss, who were learning that sanctuary existed, that healing was possible. The snow began falling around midnight, soft and silent against the windows. I watched it accumulate on the pine branches on the dock, on the roof of the workshop, where tomorrow Tom would teach another wounded soul that creation could triumph over destruction. This wasn't the future I'd imagined when Helen was alive. It wasn't the golden years we'd planned growing old together in the house we'd built with love and intention. But it was something equally valuable, a legacy of healing, a testament to the belief that what we build can serve purposes larger than ourselves. The grandfather clock chimed 12 times, marking the transition to Christmas Day. In the living room below the fire, I'd banked would burn through the night, keeping watch over a house that had become what it was always meant to be: a sanctuary, a shelter, a place where broken things could be made whole. I lay down in the bed I'd once shared with Helen, pulled the quilt she'd stitched over me, and listened to the house breathe around me. The soft creak of someone walking to the bathroom, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant settling of logs in the fireplace, the sounds of home. Not the home I'd expected, but the one I'd chosen to create from the ashes of grief and the determination to honor what mattered most. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet promise. Inside, 7 veterans slept in rooms that had once stood empty, healing in a space that remembered what it meant to be loved, protected and valued for more than its market price. And I slept the sleep of a man who'd fought the fight that mattered and won, not by defeating his enemies, but by remaining true to the values that had guided a lifetime of building things meant to last. The house Helen and I had created would stand for decades, yet serving purposes we'd never imagined, but would have embraced without hesitation. That knowledge was enough, more than enough. It was peace. If you agree, type yes.